We're here today with the Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley. Randy's an activist, scholar, author, teacher, wisdom keeper, and Cherokee descendant, recognized by the Keetoowah Band, who speaks on justice, faith, the earth, and indigenous realities. He's the author of numerous books, including Shalom in the Community of Creation and Living in Color. He and his wife, Edith, co-sustain Aloe Indigenous Center for Earth and Justice and Aloe Farm and Seeds outside of Portland, Oregon. Randy's new book is titled Becoming Rooted, 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth from Broadleaf Books. You can learn more at randywoodley.com. So Randy, it's really a pleasure to have you join us today. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for the invitation, Brian. Good to be here.
Well, you've done so much wonderful work. I would love to share with folks more about your background, and then we'll get into your books.
Oh, let's see. I think you covered everything in my life right there in that introduction.
Well, tell us more about the Indigenous Center and the Farm and Seeds companies, if you could.
Yeah, please. Like I always think of bio introductions and obituaries as an exercise in futility, right? There's a lot involved in each life lived in all of us. So, yeah, just very briefly, biographically, I'm the husband of Edith, and I have 4 children and 6 grandchildren, living outside of Portland, Oregon, in the just in the beginning of the foothills of the coastal mountain range. Been doing a lot of things most of our lives. My wife and I were involved in one way or another with the serving indigenous people around the United States and Canada, and mentoring people, a pastor, just different things like that. So, and we've done just about everything that we could do. Aloha became a vision out of that journey. We saw the inadequacy of both the government and the church in trying to deal with our indigenous people. And so we created, I guess you'd say, a new model. I don't know if it's not a formula, but sort of a new way of doing things. And it was pretty successful. We're involved in every kind of aspect of Native people's lives, I think, from houseless, serving houseless people, to after-school programs for kids, to language programs, and baby needs closets, food closets, feeding programs, et cetera, et cetera. But the goal of the government and the goal of the church, which have worked in tandem with Native people for so long, was to create a dependence. And our goal was to create empowerment. And so Aloha Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Aloha Farm and Seeds is our third and final attempt. We had 2 iterations before to create an empowerment center, both for our Native people, and a healing center, an empowerment center for non-Native people as well, because along the way we learned that we all have to heal together in order to change the world and make this a better place to live in for our grandchildren and et cetera. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, sometime in the future, I want to hear more about Aloha. So we'll do that another time.
Right.
But in any event, you've written several books before the most recent one. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, I think my first published book, not self-published, but published by a publisher, was Living in Color, Embracing God's Passion for Ethnic Diversity. And the goal there was to try to educate non-Native pastors and just non-Native lay people on God's passion for diversity. They, to try and understand that the universe is built on this unity and diversity principle. It's a part of everything that is out there that Creator made, and it is a part of God's self, as in terms of this whole unity and diversity. It's the DNA of our Creator, if you will. And so it makes sense that this sort of a tendency for human beings to be homogeneous, which is, sometimes a good thing, as I talk about in the book, but we're not meant to live that way. We're not challenged. We don't grow. as much when we're in a supposed homogeneous environment. Now, the truth is, none of us are the same. We're all different. And so we learn from the differences. So that was the first book. Then I wrote Shalom in the Community of Creation, an Indigenous Vision, which was basically an understanding of the bigger picture shalom in the whole of Scripture, what Jesus' connection is to that, and how it relates, coincides with our Native American understanding of what we would call the harmony way. Each tribe has a different way of expressing that, but in Cherokee it would be Elahe. And this is that big picture where what I call the original instructions, where nobody's hungry, the earth is producing what it's supposed to do, nobody's at war, there are means of settling disagreements that are peaceable. Just that whole piece, that whole idea that we're supposed to be living a particular way, and there are things that have come along down the pike that have caused us to move away from that, those instructions, or that shalom living, if you will. And so that's what I address in that book. And that's sort of what I became known for so long, was this shalom idea and shalom book. And I wanted to see if there was a way that we could relate to our indigenous people that was not oppressive, that was not paternalistic, and all of that. And so this is where we sort of go through all of that. And that's when I began to understand the difference between what is an indigenous worldview and a Western worldview, and why it's so important when you look at Scripture and things like this. Then one of my former students and myself wrote a book, Bo Sanders, who I do a podcast with, piecing it all together. And we wrote Decolonizing Evangelicalism, and then the Becoming Rooted, Indigenous Theology in a Western Worldview, where I break that whole system down and add more to it. And then I have another book coming out in the fall called Mission and the Cultural Other, a closer look, where I examine the whole Western mission paradigm and sort of what it's based on. And then I'm getting ready to write another book. So yeah,
very
lots
good.
of fun writing.
Well, you've been very productive. So let's get into the new book I mentioned, Becoming Rooted, 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth. This is from Broadleaf Books. What motivated you to do this one?
Yeah, so these other books sort of take on the problem head on, if you will. They look at the sort of deeply into a Western worldview and sort of the limitations and the sort of what I would say perversions of some of it. The Western worldview, I don't believe, I think it's a failed experiment. I don't think it's going to sustain our future. And so we have to find something else. Well, the closest thing to my reality is our indigenous worldview. And I believe that is a sustainable worldview, especially as I look at this continent. Indigenous people have been gifted with the wisdom to live with the land instead of on the land, or extract from the land, and sort of bend it without breaking it. And that didn't just come naturally. It wasn't utopia. It was learned over thousands and thousands of years. And so it would be foolish to reject that kind of experience and wisdom. And yet that's exactly what's happened in the West, is to reject those kinds of ideas. And so instead of sort of hitting the problem head on, I wanted to find a way that what if, we have people come for schools and things out here at Elahe, and they sort of walk with us for, 3.5 days. Most of our schools are about that long. And we see changes. We see like complete worldview changes, actually, which is amazing. I mean, that's not a small thing at all. And I thought, what's a way that I could translate that to just sort of walking with people day to day? And so this whole idea I come up with of 100 days, I don't, some people will go through the whole 100, some people will pick and choose. It's okay, whatever you want to do, but I'm really fortunate on this book because I've been able to get a lot of instant feedback from people, like within weeks. I've gotten so much good feedback. that it is actually changing people's lives and worldviews and thoughts and the ways that they look at nature and the ways they look at the God of nature, and kind of giving them permission to fall in love with the world again, with the earth and the whole community of creation out there. And so I think it's accomplishing what I wanted, which is to, hey, I want to be there with you and go through this. I share my experiences. I share experiences of other folks that I've had life experience with. I share a little bit of traditional stories and just kind of, and then at the end of every little meditation, because there's 100 of them, right? So they couldn't be long, 3 to 5 paragraphs, basically. There's an action point. And most of those action points are now go outside and do this, or that. And so I'm trying to reconnect people, even if they just have a backyard or an apartment porch, that there's some way to connect with God's creation. So.
So tell us more what the word Elohe means and how can we live in the Elohe way?
Yeah. So Elohe is akin to this big picture shalom. So most people sort of look at shalom and they go, oh, peace. But that is that's a drop in the bucket, right? It's a much broader and deeper construct. And there's all these derivative words from shalom. And it means all this kind of stuff like not just peace, but it means fullness. It means like where God is in charge. It means abundance. It means, repayment, setting things right, all these different kinds of things. Well, Elohe is much the same. Elohe is basically, I took Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, who's really good at understanding what shalom's about from a biblical point of view. And then I compared that with our indigenous harmony ways, not just Cherokee and Elohe, but I actually, for my PhD work, I looked at 45 different tribes. And then I found all the similarities. There's so many parallels. And that's what sort of been packed into each indigenous peoples. And I found out that, as I studied and had friends and knew others from around the world, I found similar constructs with, Zulu, with the Ubuntu, with the Maasai, with indigenous people in Australia, the Aboriginal folks, with Maoris in New Zealand, with Ikalahan Filipino in northern islands of the Philippines, with Sami people up in Scandinavia. So there's so much sort of fullness and richness involved in all of this that this is like just a God construct, right? This is something that the best of sort of everything, and it's not utopia. And that's the sort of mistake people think is, oh, you're talking about utopia and we'll have that in heaven or something like. No, that's not what it's about at all. It's about sort of learning from our mistakes and living the best person and the best people and the best communities that we can be while we're here. And so that's all packed into that word Elohe.
Well, we have a lot of learning to do, right? A lot of deconstructing, decolonizing of all the stuff that we've got ourselves into. So no doubt about that. So the book, you divided it into 10 sections, right? So how did you decide what the 10 sections, 10, parts would be and what would go into each one?
Yes. Well, I wish I could say it was planned out more than it was. But basically I write and then I go back and I organize. And so the sort of like after I started writing, and I did sort of have an idea like of most of the sections, what I wanted to do, right? And then somewhere along the way I go, oh, this fits better over here than here. But it was all sort of like editorial presumption, I guess you'd say, just like trying to figure out. And one of the problems in translating an indigenous worldview to a Western worldview is the problem of categorization. Like the West is really good at categorizing things and parsing them out so that they almost become separate realities, right? And that's my weakness. So I got a lot of editorial help from Valerie at Broadleaf Books, and trying to move things around and switch them. And that's probably my weakest area, is because to me, it's all the same. It's all one, right? It all flows together. So.
Well, I know Valerie's done a great job with several of the authors I've been, interviewing recently, so I'm not surprised.
She's great to work with.
Good, good. So I'd like to read one sentence from the book. You say, planting your roots on the land in which you live is the only way to restore harmony and balance on Earth. So can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So if you look at the way that our theologies and philosophies have created a sort of disembodiment, if you will, a separation from, so that like a lot of the Christians, for example, who I've talked to, when you start talking about the earth, they get really like scared, because it's like, that's pagan, or that's witchcraft, or that's, it's like, the opposite of what our creator meant when the earth was created. And so how do you get people to cross over, and except for to sort of walk with them? And I guess that's the job. And I think that this dates back like at least 3,000 years ago with I think Platonic dualism, which is a big construct. But basically Plato. So I'm going to try and break it down in 30 seconds here. Plato basically believed, as a philosopher, that life, the reality of life, is more ethereal, or in the mind, than it was in the body and the material world. And so he teaches Aristotle, his student. Aristotle teaches Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great spreads this philosophy, basically is wrapped up in all these systems of economics and education and architecture and art and everything else throughout the world. So the known world at that time of what we call Hellenism, or Greek thought, Greek ways, Greek lifestyle, Greek philosophy, Greek worldview, and that dies out after a while. But in Europe, in between the 14th and 17th centuries, it's reawakened in something they call the Renaissance, right? And that's all about, Greek thinking, Greek art, Greek architecture, the philosophers, et cetera, et cetera. And then out of that movement, two movements are born: the Enlightenment, which sort of doubled down on that, and the Reformation, which basically is not cognizant of how deeply affected they are by this Greek worldview. And so the emphasis becomes a disembodied theology through the Enlightenment, so that no longer is it's as important as what you do on earth, or the earth itself, or even your body. But what's really important is that you think correctly, that you have the right doctrine. And they have wars over it. They kill each other over the right doctrine. So all of that is a result of this Platonic dualism, this way of separating our minds and our spirit from our bodies in the earth. And that's living out of a false reality. And so our theologies have been developed that way, our philosophies, our economic systems, our education systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we're trying to do is, in a sense, from an indigenous perspective, put Humpty Dumpty back together again and say, all of this is reality. And these categories, they're fine for understanding things, but we can't understand them outside of how they relate to the whole. Now, all of that's a lot of sort of fancy footwork about philosophy and theology. In this book, I actually tried to stay away from all of that and just sort of say it in a way that we could just walk day to day. And so that was kind of the idea there.
So I tried to relate, the specific words that you used in that sense about planting your roots in the place where you live to my own life. Somewhat literally. So I grew up in a small town in Illinois, which was kind of the Potawatomi and Iroquois area. Now I live in central New Jersey, and I've lived here for like 30 some years, where Lenape, was the predominant tribe of the area. And I have a hard time rooting myself to the land here, so to speak, more than I did where I grew up. I still feel closer to that land and that history than I do here. And I don't know if it's because it was more rural and less developed. Where I live in New Jersey's, it's all developed. It's all commercial. It's all modern. There's very little in way of remnants of what it used to be, other than what I can read in some books. So how do I deal with that? How do I root myself, in a place where I have a hard time being rooted, really rooted to
Yeah.
the land, so to speak.
Yeah. So, and I talk about this in the introduction a lot. I say some what people think are maybe outrageous statements. I say we're all indigenous from somewhere.
Yeah.
The separation of time and place. We come from indigenous people who knew how to live in a particular place with the earth and sustain themselves, or else we wouldn't be here, right? And so, and that's true in North America, for example, that each sort of people had a place and a way of living and understanding that. I myself, even though I'm a Kituwa Cherokee person, which our homelands are really in the southeastern United States, I grew up in Michigan among the Ojibwe people and Ojibwe land. And so I grew up with a deep respect and friendship with Ojibwe peoples and the land, and to help me see the land through their eyes. That was very formative in my early years. But I've moved around a lot, lived in a lot of different places, and in each place I've tried to come to build relationship with and understand the indigenous peoples and what their plight is and how they understood the land that they're with, and then sort of borrow from that, if you will, not misappropriate traditions or culture, but to borrow those values, right? Those values that how deeply they're connected to the lands and particular places. And that's been really rich in my life. My wife has the opposite experience. She grew up on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. That's her land. That's where she grew up most of the time. And she was always going to be connected just to that. But we're also learning, because we are settlers as well in the land that we live in, the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, that there's a lot we have to learn from the indigenous peoples here. And there's a lot from our own indigeneity that we can look at the land and understand it better. And so this idea of we all have resources, if you will, out there to help us understand the land that we're on and how to be planted in that land.
Well, it's an area I need to do more research on. It's like I've been doing a little bit more in Illinois.
I think it does start with the history, understanding from especially from a Native perspective, the history of the land.
Yeah.
And then understanding, I always, one of the exercises I think in the book is like to go out and look at like a river or whatever you're at, and remember that there were probably indigenous people with families, kids playing, and how do you think they enjoyed the land?
Mm-hmm.
So that we can create in our minds and our hearts that these were real people, right? And their descendants are still here, most of them. And so here we are in reality, and there's just a whole lot more that us settler people, me and my wife, both being out of our native lands, from the indigenous people who are here as well.
So I'd like to read a couple of endorsements of the book. One is from our friend Lisa Sharon Harper. She says, "This is a must read for everyone who longs for peace." How does the book address that need?
Yeah, I think I addressed that in a couple sections, but mostly probably in the section where I talk about an American dream as an indigenous nightmare, and that basically shows the difference in values between what we've been taught in a very competitive Western worldview is important, and what a cooperative indigenous worldview can bring. And that's the roots of peace, is trying to understand from another perspective, right? And so America, and I actually talk about this in some of my other books, but that America is war, not America as war. But yeah, there's only been a few times in our histories that we have not been at war with someone somewhere. And so it's a very different myth, if you will, than Canada, for example, who has largely settled things through treaty making. And yeah, there's an argument in the First Nations people up there that, a lot of the treaties haven't been kept. And so but they come at it like, hey, let's look at the treaty and then go back to it and let's work this out, rather than coming at it like, you stole this from us and you forced us and you killed us. And, there was just not a whole lot of genocide, if you will. There was the genocide of the boarding schools, the residential boarding schools in Canada, as well as the U.S., but which was cultural genocide. But yeah, it's a different mythology, if you will, a different myth. And they take us two different places. One sets us down at a table together, and the other leads us to war with each other. It's sort of, and that's part of that Greek thinking too, is that binary. It's either this or this, So I think there's ways to resolve those differences, but we have to begin at a place where we're both willing to see from each other's perspectives.
Hmm. So another endorsement was from Stephen Charleston. He says, Randy Woodley reminds us that we all have an understanding of what it means to be indigenous to a spiritual place. Can you talk about this idea of being indigenous to a spiritual place?
Yeah, and that goes back to the dualism, right? So the whole idea is in the West is that the spirit, the body, are sort of like two different things instead of part of the same reality. Like we're a spirit and we're a body and we're emotions and we're, and rather than understand like all of these things sort of interplay with each other is who we are, right? Like, and my body is spiritual, and the land is spiritual. If I can basically find a way to get the mind melded with the body, we understand, or with the spirit with the body, or the mind with the land, and understand that everything is sacred. Everything is spiritual. There's no such thing as a secular this and a sacred this. And that's, again, part of that Western worldview is that taught us, like, certain things are sacred, but certain things aren't. Like church on Sunday, sacred. Wednesday nights, sacred. Tuesday night, bowling, not sacred. So, we have to come back to, like I said, put Humpty Dumpty back together in a whole reality and say everything is spiritual. Jesus said very clearly, hey, don't swear by heaven because that's God's throne, and don't swear by the earth because that's God's footstool. It's just the idea like everything is sacred, right? And so we need to treat it as such, including other people and the whole community of creation and the very land that we're on. And if we can sort of get that deep inside of us, our whole being, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in terms of, the climate change and everything else that's going on, because the earth would have been treated differently.
So looking forward, you mentioned earlier that you've got another book coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so Becoming Rooted came out January 3rd, I think, of this year. Just barely made it into the new year. April 19th, I had a book called Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, a decolonial approach to Christian doctrine, come out. And that's where I try to present what I would call an indigenous theology, or an indigenous way of doing theology, which is a lot of narrative and things like this. But, and by the way, the Bible is 90% narrative. And so if we don't understand what story is about, then we can't even approach the scriptures and pretend like we understand them. So the people who wrote those stories, sitting around a campfire telling those stories, and then later someone else writes them down, and those were stories written from people who were not post-Enlightenment bound thinkers. They were pre-Enlightenment, probably affected very little more indigenous than Greek thinking, and so when you go to hear those stories, you don't ask Greek questions like, oh, the first thing that comes to mind, did this really happen? That's not what the writer intended. The writer intended for us to learn the truth of the story. And so, so we go along and we get to the place where I tell a lot of stories in that, and I try to tell meaningful ones that, and I talk a little bit about the Western worldview and take that apart and sort of look at that in a much deeper way. And then I've got this one, which maybe is the one you're referencing. I don't know, Mission in the Cultural Other.
Yeah.
A closer look. So I'm actually, my PhD is in intercultural studies, but it was because I got it at Asbury Seminary, East Stanley Jones School of Mission and Evangelism. That's World Mission, I'm sorry. I'm in effect a missiologist. I'm somebody who has studied, qualified, understood the anthropological basis for mission and all those kinds of things. So I'm an anthropologist, interculturalist, missiologist, if you will. And so I think it's time from an indigenous perspective, who we probably have the worst record of the church of anybody around the world, although it's quite a competition of how we were treated as a people by missionaries and mission agencies, mission sending agencies, not to condemn all missionaries, of course, but the whole system was based on this hierarchy. And one of the hierarchies that comes out of this Greek thinking is like when you start placing everything in a hierarchy, like the mind above the spirit, the material above, or the ethereal above the material world, everything starts coming in hierarchies. And so you have hierarchies of gender. So men are now more important than women, and human beings are more important than the rest of creation. And, white folks, white European-based folks are more important than the rest. And these are just sort of all been developed over these 3,000 years. It's baked in the bread. It's something that has just basically come into the system, not something that anybody chose. But as a result, you have this sense of this white normalcy and white privilege. And I see those as, when I talk about white supremacy, I talk about basically saying everything white is normal rather than everything is different and can be different and still be normal, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the ground one of mission, was to basically save the heathen and teach them to be white. And no one said, oh, we're going to make them white people. But what they said is, we're going to make them civilized, which meant basically white European, right? And so with that being the basis, Rudyard Kipling's poem is a great example of that. The poem that talks about rescuing the heathen and it's white man's burden. He has in there. It's the white man's burden to go out and civilize the rest of the world. And very British notion, right? It's but it caught on here as well because it was just part of the process. And so I'm looking at mission and saying, okay, what would that be like if it wasn't done from that projection? Point.
Interesting.
What would mission be if we had it sort of like a different sort of a theology that wasn't based in this white supremacist ideas? And that's the point of the book. And I don't think anything's been quite written like that to my knowledge so far. So I'm really excited about it.
When is that coming out?
That should be, I think it's supposed to be out in November, but right now they're still in the final editing process. So I haven't gotten word yet. The original word was we try to get it in late fall, but I'm hoping it makes it.
Good. Well, we'll look forward to that. And maybe we can, talk more about it then. So again, for now, at least, the book that's we were talking about, Becoming Rooted, 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth. And you can learn more about this book and all of Randy's books at randywoodley.com. So Randy, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yeah, I did forget to mention that I also write children's books.
Oh, yes.
I've written a children's book called The Harmony Tree, a story of healing and community. And then that's part of a trilogy as well. And that's actually my favorite. I think Becoming Rooted and that one are my two favorites in terms of watching them do what I wanted them to do when I wrote them. So
Very
yeah,
cool.
thanks for mentioning that. And yeah, and also you can find out about our organization at eloheh, eloheh.org.
Okay, cool. Well, Randy, thanks so much. Really appreciate your work, and thanks for spending some time with us.
Yeah, Brian, appreciate being on. Thank you.